Hello and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. This is the 17th episode of the Latham & Watkins Drug Pricing Series, and I'm Chris Schott, a partner in the healthcare and life sciences practice in our Washington, D.C. office. I focus my practice on all things market access, and that includes manufacturer compliance related to the Medicaid Drug Rebate Program, Medicare Parts B and D, and the 340B Drug Pricing Program, as well as, of course, implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and other healthcare reform initiatives, such as state laws. Let me put in a quick plug. I'm pleased to announce the relaunch of the Latham & Watkins Drug Pricing Digest, where we track reports or coverage from the trade press, government publications, and releases and court opinions. We intend to distribute the digest at the start of every other week, and if you want to get it in your inbox rather than just finding it online, we'll include a subscription link in the podcast notes. Today, I'm happy to welcome two guests on the podcast, Latham partners Ben Haas and Bill McConagha. If you've tuned into the podcast before, then you'll be familiar with them as they've both been guests previously. But Ben, why don't we start with you? Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Thank you, Chris. I'm a FDA partner and global vice chair of the Latham's Healthcare and Life Sciences Practice Group here in DC. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Bill, how are you today?
Thanks, Chris. I am great. I am an FDA partner in Latham's Healthcare and Life Sciences Practice Group, like Ben. Before joining private practice, I worked at FDA for over 17 years in a variety of capacities, including a little over a decade in the Office of Chief Counsel, a period as an assistant commissioner, and then spent almost 4 years as a health policy advisor on the Senate Help Committee, which the listeners may know is the committee of jurisdiction over FDA in the Senate.
Thanks, and thank you for joining the podcast today. In each episode, we focus on a specific topic that is relevant to market access, drug pricing, or the pharmaceutical and healthcare sectors more broadly. And after discussing the substance, we ask the question, which Olympic sport is it like? And we have the list of Olympic sports here to see which most resembles the topic in terms of strategy, complexity, or frankly, level of conflict. Seems like the intro got kind of long this time, but we finally made it to discussing today's topic. On April 15th, Trump signed an executive order titled Lowering Drug Prices by, once again, Putting Americans First. The document is not particularly long. It's about 4 printed pages. There are 14 sections, 12 of which are substantive. And obviously, a number of the sections focus on drug pricing, and we'll talk a little bit about that toward the end of the podcast. But more interesting, and really the focus of our discussion here today, are the FDA related sections in the executive order. And so, what are those sections? Well, today we plan to focus primarily on 2 things here. Section 9 talks about accelerating the approval of generics and biosimilars, and Section 10 talks about drug importation programs that states can run to import drugs from Canada. We'll also talk a bit with Bill and Ben about some of the congressional proposals that also target farmers' activities in the drug approval and pricing space. So let's get started. Bill, maybe we begin with the importation concept. So we know the idea of importing drugs from Canada has been around for quite a while, and President Trump appears to be showing renewed interest here. Can you provide some background on what the Section 804 provision here basically is?
Sure. Glad to do it. And thanks, Chris. So, again, this is Section 10 of the executive order in which the president is essentially directing HHS and the commissioner of FDA within 90 days to take steps to streamline and improve the importation program under Section 804, as you mentioned. And so happy to spend a moment discussing what this is. So, Section 804 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, was last amended in 2003, so over 20 years ago, under the Medicare Modernization Act. And it created a provision in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that allows for the importation of certain prescription drugs from Canada by pharmacists and wholesalers in the United States. And it's worth noting that an essential feature of this legislation, this provision in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act now, is the idea that for any importation program to become effective, there had to be a threshold determination by the Secretary of HHS that the importation would, 1, pose no additional risk to the public health and safety, and 2, would result in a significant reduction in cost of the covered drugs to the American consumer. And I'll pause there on this idea that it's the American consumer. So there actually had to be some demonstrable savings to the consumer who was, procuring the drug, not simply a lower cost that got consumed by so-called middlemen in the process. So for nearly 20 years, the law lay dormant, so to speak, as no secretary of HHS made this certification. And this included both Republican and Democratic administrations. So there was, for any number of reasons, a decision not to make the certification. And so for many who follow this closely, like those of us in this practice, there was this sense that the certification provision was sort of a poison pill. It was a threshold that simply couldn't be met to effectuate the law. And so the law had this symbolic value, but it was never going to actually become effective. So the breakthrough that brings us to the discussion we're having today occurred in October 2020 in President Trump's first administration. So, Chris, the Secretary of HHS under Trump in that first administration made the certification under Section 804 in 2020. And FDA actually went so far as to promulgate a rulemaking to kind of effectuate the program, to basically build the architecture of what this program would be. And that is found in 21 CFR Part 251. So the new rulemaking, consistent with Section 804, allows for states to sponsor what are called SIPs or SIPs. And this acronym stands for a Section 804 import program, which is truly a horrible acronym, but that's what the SIP is. And under the SIP program, a state or Indian tribe is able to propose kind of an importation program. And then, as part of it, expected to kind of manage and oversee the importation of the drugs in a way that assures their safety, in a way that assures the savings of the consumers. And they have to follow a fairly complex FDA process involving kind of categorization, authorization, some testing. I'll elaborate on this in a moment. But much of this is in the law itself, and then finds additional extension in this rulemaking. And I guess I would say, at the risk of oversimplifying this, I think the easiest way to think of the program is as having two kind of big steps. The first is the state or local government submits this SIP to FDA, which lays out its specific program, its partners, its safety controls. And if FDA authorizes a SIP, then a huge step forward has been taken. But there is a second piece of this, which is that the sponsor must then submit a pre-importation request for separate review and authorization by FDA. And this step calls for more detail about the specific products that will be imported, and it deals with some of the most complex features of the law, which relate to kind of mandatory testing requirements to ensure that the drugs are authentic, clarity about who's going to do that testing, um, uh, clarity on how the product will be labeled, and some other very technical issues. There are other important factors to keep in mind as part of this. One is that by terms of the statute, certain drugs are not even eligible for inclusion in the SIP. And this includes biologics, it includes IV drugs, products that are covered by a REM. So, almost by definition, it's a limited universe of products that can come in under this program. Typically, there would be solid oral dosage or subcutaneous drugs. And the theory is these would be the blockbuster type drugs that are, under a period of exclusivity, brand name products in the United States, for which there would be a price differential between the price for sale in the US and the price for sale in Canada. Chris, the second point is to say that by law, the supply chain has to be kind of very carefully limited here. There is supposed to be one manufacturer, one foreign seller, one importer, each with different responsibilities. And so, for this to work at all, there has to be some discipline around the way this supply chain works. So, the state that has made the most progress to date in moving forward with this is the state of Florida, which submitted a SIP through something called the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration. And it was revised several times between November 2020 and late 2023. And it was actually authorized by FDA, the SIP was, in January of 2024. So notably, it was authorized during the Biden administration. And so while the certification occurred under the Trump administration and the rulemaking, the program was promulgated under the Trump administration, the Biden administration took this a step forward and they authorized the SIP. So Florida then submitted this pre-importation request, and it has not yet been approved. And so the program has never gone live. And towards the very end of the Biden administration, in December of last year, December 2024, FDA granted the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration an additional 6 months until July of this year to complete the required steps to get approval of the pre-importation request and launch the SIP. And so the idea is that it is still very much alive and pending. And now Trump is back, and the executive order seeks to make this a priority again. And I see, just to wrap up the background here, kind of this EO is a way to communicate that this is a policy priority to the public. At the same time, it's kind of admonishing FDA to figure out how to move this forward. And I guess I should also note, just for the listeners who don't follow this closely, that I'm focused on Florida because they've made the most progress to date under this law. But there are a number of other states that are working on mature programs and have submitted SIPs. So Colorado, Vermont, Maine, New Mexico have also submitted SIPs that are not yet approved.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Very helpful to lay out this background. I'll note that Connecticut has a pending bill that would, talk about how that state is supposedly to then try to also engage in this program. So you mentioned that this has been around in the statute for quite a long time. So what are some recent changes to the Section 804 SIP program?
I don't know that there are any kind of major recent changes, at least that go beyond the kind of the last milestone in this, which was the extension of the time frame for the pre-importation request at the end of the Biden administration. I think the new story here is the executive order from the Trump administration, and I think fundamentally it's seeking to kind of accelerate approval, not only for perhaps Florida, but also to find a way to simplify the administration of the program. I think what's buried in the executive order is this idea that, for whatever reason, the pre-importation request has been a stumbling block. Why is it taking it such a long time for this to move forward? Why haven't they gotten to yes? I think the executive order is admonishing FDA to try and figure this out. In terms of recent develops, I will note that, for whatever it's worth, the new administration did pull down from FDA's website a link to the Biden executive order that expressed support for the SIP program. I don't find that surprising, right? One administration takes down the executive orders of the other. It is certainly not to be interpreted as an act of hostility towards the importation program. I think quite the opposite. As noted, this really came to fruition in the first Trump administration, and so this is an extension of that. I'll also note that, as at least it relates to the timing for Florida, that the December 2024 letter from the Biden administration that gave the Florida program until July to kind of come back and try and solve the problems in the pre-importation request also says that Florida could ask for another extension by May 6th of this year if they need one. So there's clearly a mechanism in place to kind of extend the review here and work this out. And it seems to all of us that at this point that the Florida experience is the bellwether.
That's very interesting to hear how things have progressed. And what are some other factors maybe that are slowing down the progress? Because it's been around for a long time. Florida's been added for a long time. What are some other factors here that might explain why it's taking so long?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know the details of the pre-importation request and where the hangups are, but I think what they highlight is that there are complexities when the kind of rubber meets the road, so to speak, here, which have to do with these questions about how you're going to test to prove the authenticity of the drug you're bringing in, how you're going to deal with the labeling issue. There are provisions in the rulemaking in the law that talk about kind of compulsory sharing of information by the brand name drug company to kind of help assist with this process. And my guess is that there have been stumbling blocks there. I will note that, just more generally, I think there are also a variety of other potential obstacles here that could slow things down generally. The first is litigation. So if one of these SIPs goes live, I think it's almost certain that the brand name drug manufacturers are going to sue. So in 2020, when the rulemaking was promulgated by the Trump administration, pharma, on behalf of the drug industry in the United States, filed litigation to try and stop the SIP. This was in a lawsuit filed in federal court in D.C. And they argued, among other things, that the kind of compulsory data sharing that I just referenced, the provision of labels, these things violated intellectual property rights of the companies. They abridged free speech. And I think a really interesting kind of cause of action here is this idea that they were uncompensated takings under the Constitution. And so my sense is that those issues will continue to be pursued. The suit itself was dismissed in February 2023 on the grounds that there was no particular SIP authorized at the time, and so it never reached the merits. but it was dismissed without prejudice. So if a SIP goes live, I fully expect pharma will file again. Um, Another potential issue to think of in all of this as at least an obstacle down the line is the Canadian reaction. So I don't know the very latest, but the government of Canada has signaled on many occasions that it's not going to permit the sale of these Canadian drugs into the U.S. under the kind of terms laid out here, and um, and so they could try to block it from the source. And certainly the kind of current political dynamics relating to the tariffs and the kind of the relationship between the U.S. and Canada right now is another complexity in all of this. I think a related practical question, frankly, just has to do with volumes. So, it's one thing if a SIP or two gets authorized in the United States, but it's hard to imagine as a practical matter how this works on a truly kind of widespread systematic basis. I think there are what, roughly 330 million people in the United States. There are roughly 40 million in Canada. So it's not clear how Canadian pharmacies are going to serve the local population and then be able to serve kind of 8 times that to their neighbor to the south. And it's just something to think about. And I think that what critics of the law would say is that very reality means that the only way that this could really work, if it was ever to work on kind of a widespread scale, would be that people would be transshipping drugs from elsewhere in the world through Canada into the United States, which is precisely a risk that the law seeks to avoid or safeguard against, but might become kind of a real practical tension as we deal with these kind of volume questions. Um, and I guess I'll just add that, finally, as I mentioned a moment ago, the terms of the pre-importation plan are by themselves under the law kind of quite complicated. And as with all such things, the devil is in the details, right? The need for the testing, the labeling, the truncated supply chain are practical challenges that may make it difficult for widespread importation from Canada, even if some discrete SIPs move forward.
Wow, so it definitely sounds like there are a lot of moving parts to track here. And one question I've received multiple times from manufacturers is how would they find out if one of their, should we say, brand drugs might be a target for one of these importation programs? And Bill, it sounds like based on the pathway you've described with the brand drug information having to be shared, it seems pretty clear that a manufacturer with a targeted drug here would definitely become aware that this process is in motion. But nevertheless, it makes sense to track all these developments so that there's no surprise if something were to pop up.
And as part, I'll just add, Chris, that as part of the pre-importation request, the sponsors are obligated to identify the products that they want to bring in. So there is a mechanism to identify exactly what they're targeting on a program by program basis.
Yeah, so there would definitely be some notice. So maybe we now turn to Ben and talk about Section 9 of the executive order, which is titled Accelerating Competition for High Cost Prescription Drugs. So it looks like the CEO there is trying to speed up the introduction of cheaper drugs into the market by calling for reports and recommendations on ways to accelerate approval of generics, biosimilars, second in class, and OTC over the counter medicines. So Ben, do you have a sense of what kind of actual approaches President Trump may be seeking to pursue here?
Thank you, Chris. I think really there are two sections within the executive order that should be reviewed in tandem here. The first is, as you mentioned, Section 9. The second would be Section 13. I think it would be helpful to level set what the text of the executive order actually says on those issues because they do have very similar timelines. First, under Section 9, the executive order directs that the FDA, within 180 days or 6 months, to issue a report providing recommendations for how to accelerate the approval of generics, biosimilar drugs, and combination products to the market, while maintaining, FDA's gold standards of safety and effectiveness of all products. Second, Section 13 directs not only the FDA, but the DOJ and the Department of Commerce and the FTC to issue a joint report uh, uh, providing recommendations on how to reduce any competitive behavior from big pharma, from pharma manufacturers. We'll talk about a few elements of what that putative anti-competitive conduct looks like. But taken together, both the FDA and these other federal agencies have 6 months to engage in a listening session and to issue reports on how to address this. Now, if you look at the executive order, consistent with this White House. The preamble to it provides, hey, we made really good progress during the first Trump term. That progress was kneecapped, forestalled by the Biden administration. So many of the concepts that are teed up in the executive order, or what we sort of predict will be the outcome of these ongoing reviews, really do trace their provenance to steps taken by the first Trump administration to lower prescription drug costs and to likewise combat perceived anti-competitive behavior by big pharma. So, what are we talking about in particular? First, there were a series of recommendations and policy efforts in the first Trump administration. I'll cite a few here. The first was in 2017, the FDA's Drug Competition Action Plan, or DCAP, which focused on improving generic approval pathways for sponsors and FDA's own internal processes to accelerate efficiency, close loopholes, and otherwise get around the delays that were perceived to be ongoing with respect to generic competition, particularly for high cost drugs. Since 2017, at a fairly high level, FDA has made it easier for sponsors under the DCAP to proceed through the development and approval process. Among other things, I'll flag that FDA issued a final guidance on generic drug labeling in situations where the reference drugs labeling is not updated, really to allow generic manufacturers to get their drugs through the FDA process more quickly. Second, in 2018, what I'll refer to as the Drug Pricing Blueprint, official name American Patients First, the Trump administration blueprint to lower drug prices and reduce out of pocket costs, was released. That document included approaches to impose value based purchasing options, pricing negotiations, reform on Part B drug acquisition, site neutral payment policies, and more generally, the promotion of biologic innovation. And it married to improvements to the generic approval pathway. So that is another element we think as part of FDA's ongoing review, they'll pick up that blueprint and carry it forward into the report that needs to be issued in 6 months, specifically this fall in October. Finally, I'll flag the FDA final rule, additional conditions for non prescription use. This should guide the approach to facilitating OTC switches, taking prescription drug products that are only available at the pharmacy behind the counter to OTC status that can be purchased outside the counter or over the counter, I should say, in the pharmacy. That final rule had an effective date, or has an effective date in May 27, 2025. The final rule was delayed by the administration transition. And what it does, it implements the second part of Section 9 by establishing a pathway to allow more drug products to switch to OTC through quote unquote additional conditions, allowing sponsors to provide information beyond what can be provided under the OTC drug labeling system, i.e., the drug facts label. This process and that final rule and the implementation of the OTC rule is seen as a priority for the new FDA commissioner.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks for walking through all of that and making the connection here between the EO and other existing initiatives. And I think in that same vein, let's take a look at Congress. It seems that Congress also, of course, is concerned still with the price for drugs and in particular the behavior of pharma manufacturers, where there seems to be always this allegation that manufacturers trying to limit competition through various means. Ben, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening on the Hill in that regard?
Well, it's an age old issue. I've been doing this for 25 years, and since the first day I started, there have been efforts by brand drug manufacturers to forestall or delay a generic competition. Likewise, there have been efforts by the generic industry to facilitate the ease of entry to get around pharma patents and to bring products to the market more quickly. It's been an issue, as I noted, for many years. Congress, picking up the baton from Trump, seems particularly eager to push forward bills that would address what they perceive to be misconduct. Particularly, Senator Chuck Grassley is focused on some of these practices that have grown in the industry over the years. He's the sponsor of at least 5 bills. introduced in the Senate Judiciary Committee in recent weeks. Many of these bills have bipartisan support of both Republicans and Democrats. I'll address a few of those here. The first and perhaps most interesting or compelling is the Stop Stalling Act, which is officially entitled the Stop Significant and Time Wasting Abuse Limiting Legitimate Innovation of New Generics Act, or Stop Stalling Act. Now, who's coming up with these names? I don't know. That is quite a mouthful, but what it does and what it's referred to colloquially is the SHAM Act. It's intended to stop Big Pharma from using so-called sham citizen petitions to forestall or significantly delay generic competition. Chris, I should say a few words on citizen petitions because when you take a step back, they are generally considered important for the public health. What a citizen petition allows is for any stakeholder, whether it's a member of industry, an individual, a public health group, etc., to file a public petition with the FDA that asks FDA to take or refrain from taking the action specified in the citizen petition. So it's a way for non-regulated stakeholders, i.e. individuals, to try to secure an action from the FDA, and FDA is generally subject to a review clock to respond to those submissions. But, like many other tools in the regulatory toolkit, citizen petitions can be abused if they are filed at the last minute, simply to delay a final approval of a follow-on generic, et cetera. And, certainly Big Pharma has been accused of that type of misconduct, of not filing meritorious petitions, but rather petitions really just intended to extend the clock. Brand companies are filing sham petitions, often perceived to be at the 11th hour. They raise dubious claims, they waste FDA's time and resources, and ultimately, many of them, if not the vast majority, are rejected. Critics of the process and the citizen petition process, as I noted, at 30,000 feet, it's very valuable to the public, uh, have, have argued that it has actually done more to harm the public health and to help it because it's become a tool in the toolkit as a way to delay generic competition. And I should be clear here that when we talk about delays, they can be very financially significant. So each day that a brand company maintains a market presence or monopoly, I should say, could mean millions of dollars. So we're not talking about a week not being that big of a deal. It can be quite a big deal when we talk about high value medication. So the Grassley bill would seek to curb those putative abuses of the citizen petition process by doing many things. Among other things, they would grant FTC authority to bring civil actions against parties filing what are uh, determined to be sham petitions with the FDA. It provides for penalties up to and greater than $50,000 per calendar day of review or revenue earned by the seller of the branded product in the context of a sham citizen petition. And finally, it defines a sham citizen petition in a very specific way. Um, Objective and reasonableness of the petition, a party's intention, objective intent to delay approval of a generic or biosimilar product. And then the petition is part of a series of petitions or a pattern of conduct intended to forestall, if not impede, generic competition altogether. So, Chris, there's that Grassley bill. Another proposed bill, the Drug Competition Enhancement Act, also seeks to halt so called product hopping, which is generally viewed as a means for branded pharma to avoid generic competition. By doing what? Well, what it would outlaw are very minor, small modifications to a drug or a biologic that are intended to extend a patent term or to limit or delay a lower cost generic market entry. This is commonly referred to as product hopping. When you make a product change or you obtain a new patent for a very minor modification, really just to first prevent a generic applicant from obtaining follow-on approval of that prior formulation, but to evergreen the product, preserve the competitive insulation in perpetuity, forever. There are two types of product hopping that are addressed by this bill. The first is a hard switch, which is when a brand, a manufacturer discontinues or withdraws an application and introduces a follow-on product with patent protection within a certain period relative to that generic or biosimilar approval. The second is a soft switch, which is when a brand manufacturer takes actions that, quote unquote, unfairly disadvantage the listed drug or reference product relative to a follow on product. So, specific exemptions would exist under this bill. I urge everyone to read it. But again, this is another legislative effort to avoid what is perceived to be a pretty common tactic by big pharma to preserve market monopolies over high value drugs. Lastly, the Judiciary Committee in the Senate has also introduced three bills that focus on using patent exclusivity rules to enhance competition. One of these focuses on the rather well known or so called pay for delay tactic of pharma industry, under which they would make small changes to existing practices intended to assist generic and biosimilar companies through license agreements and other means to essentially engage in corporate or commercial agreements to bring generic into cooperation to preserve the market for that product.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for walking through these first two of the five bills. I'm just happy that the word sham will finally be defined legally. I think another word that could use help here is shambolic. So we should look out for the next bill that maybe talks about that. So those are the first two of those five bills. There are three others that were introduced, which also align with a portion of the executive order. And these other three bills seem to all have one theme in common, namely that they take a negative view of patents. So I find that somewhat ironic because the 30-year-old framework established by Hatch-Waxman and the Biologics Price Competition Innovation Act really has been the foundation for the unparalleled life enhancing and I would say life saving pharmaceutical innovation that we've seen in this country. So, unfortunately, now, 30 years later, those very patents that allow innovators to benefit from their inventions and recoup the significant outlay, which of course then is used for developing further treatments and further therapeutics, that very regime is somehow coming under a shadow. Many of the provisions in these bills appear to be motivated by the sentiment that is takes a dim or negative view of patents. And the executive order, which was issued after these bills became public, strikes a bit of the same chord in Section 2. Um, Bill, do you have some thoughts on how the Hatch-Waxman regime is being regarded nowadays?
I think it's a fantastic question, and going back to the importation issue I was talking about earlier, there are a lot of folks who have been following this for a long time that have wondered if there's a concern about prices in the United States. Why don't we revisit the terms of Hatch-Waxman as opposed to say open up our borders and find these other ways to kind of nibble around the edges? Let's go to the heart of the issue, which are the terms of the Hatch-Waxman provisions that basically created the modern generic drug industry in the United States. I think others, and I would never deign to speak for Senator Grassley, but I think others would say that the architecture of kind of the deals or equities in Hatch-Waxman makes sense, but there have been abuses of the patent system that have led to perversions of what's been intended there. And so what we need to do to really effectuate the true intent of Hatch-Waxman is get our arms around some of these anti-competitive activities. Um, and uh, and so I see both sides of that argument. But I'm delighted to talk about, very briefly the other three bills just to round this out, if you can stand it, Chris.
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
All right, sounds good. So, for the sake of our listeners and just in the interest of time, I'll try and do this briefly. But there are indeed three other bills, and I'll begin with one that plays off the point that Ben was making just a moment ago about pay for delay. So, the first I'll talk about is the Preserve Access to Affordable Generics and Biosimilars Act. And this is indeed a bipartisan bill that has been introduced in several previous Congresses, and it would statutorily prohibit so-called pay for delay, the concept that Ben was talking about at the end of his remarks just a moment ago. And just, again, as a reminder, Pay for delay is when a brand name drug company and kind of an initial generic entrant enter into a deal in which the generic company is compensated for delaying entry into the market. So the generic company makes money because it's getting paid for doing nothing. The brand name company benefits because it has a continued monopoly. Same concept applies in the case of a brand name biologic and a biosimilar interchangeable. This idea is that the party that suffers in this is the American consumer and the taxpayer, to the extent that these are products that are reimbursed, because there's no lowering of the cost of these drugs in the marketplace. So this bill attempts to deal with pay for delay statutorily. It also addresses so-called reverse payments, which are settlements where transfers of value were made to potential generic competitors to settle claims of patent infringement, which gets to this point you just mentioned, Chris, about abuses in the patent system. So, as the listeners may know, in 2013, there was kind of a landmark Supreme Court case called FTC v. Watson Pharmaceuticals that held that certain of these so-called pay-for-delay agreements are prohibited as anti-competitive. And so what this bill would do is legislatively prohibit such arrangements as anti-competitive based on certain recited findings, that these arrangements are monopolistic, that they delay the marketing of generics and biosimilars, they're, antithetical to free competition and consumer interests, and most fundamentally, antitrust principles, because these are really FTC bills, not FDA bills at their heart, though they clearly impact FDA-regulated products. As with all these things, the devil is in the detail. It's not clear to me that this legislation really kind of clarifies current uncertainties around the application of what it means to be anti-competitive. It says that any agreement providing a generic or biosimilar applicant with, quote, anything of value, including an exclusive license, unquote, would be presumptively anti-competitive. So it's essentially saying that the burden is on those making the deal to basically show that it's consistent with, antitrust principles. And there are certain exceptions here laid out in the statute. It does say that some agreements are permissible if it can be shown, that they are pro-competition, or at least that the pro-competition aspects of them would outweigh the anti-competition. But basically, it would do all of this legislatively. It would grant FTC specific authority to institute civil actions, and it would grant the FTC authority to get up to treble damages. So there would be a clear financial penalty disincentive into entering into these agreements. Chris, the second bill I want to touch on is the Affordable Prescriptions for Patients Act. This is also a bipartisan bill. This is also a bill that has been introduced in previous Congresses, and it includes many of the same sponsors who back the pay for delay legislation we just discussed. The bill targets manipulation of the patent system via what are called patent thickets and the patent evergreening concept that Ben just spoke about, where pharma tries to extend patents and thus essentially limit the ability of lower cost alternatives to enter into the market. It is incredibly technical, and I'm not an IP lawyer, so I'm not going to attempt to get into the weeds. I would simply confuse all of you, and I think with each sentence will advertise that I was a history major and not a scientist in college. So I'll pause there, but just simply say that we wanted to call it out today in the interest of being fulsome and kind of talking about these bills and how they may relate to the executive order, and urge listeners who may be interested in looking at the bill more closely to do so, because it is certainly a piece of this current effort to promote competition and choice in the marketplace. And to your point a moment ago, Chris, suspicious of patent abuses. Finally, the last bill to cover is the Interagency Patent Coordination and Improvement Act of 2025. Again, a bipartisan bill, again, one that has been introduced in past Congresses. Its aim is to ensure more consistency between FDA and the Patent and Trademark Office, PTO. So PTO, as our listeners may know, is supposed to get information from FDA and other agencies when examining patents to ensure that, in a sense, all the agencies are all on the same page, have access to the same patent listings. And this bill would enhance communications by requiring kind of a report on interagency exchanges and establishing an interagency task force on patents. And it's intended, I think, to address the perception that the applications, the product approval applications that get submitted to FDA for review and approval may include information relevant to patentability that has not been shared with the patent examiners. And so the idea is to kind of get the agencies together to make sure they are seeing the same things, but also to impose affirmative duties on the sponsors to be sharing the same type of patent information with both agencies to basically reduce anti-competitive surprises. And so to this fundamental question you asked when we opened this up, Chris, how does all of this relate to the executive order and in this case, particularly section 2 of the executive order? I think all these bills just remind us that patents and antitrust concepts are tools that, provide, lawmakers and the executive agencies with opportunities to try and promote, generic entry into the marketplace.
Well, Bill, thanks very much for unpacking these pretty dense technical provisions that, like you said, really stray into the intellectual property field. Maybe we can turn it back to Ben here to wrap up this FDA portion of the discussion here. Ben, how would you describe this executive order's possible impact on the FDA activities in the coming months?
It's really impossible to predict, Chris. At this point, I think this is a perfect example of, on the one hand, trying to empower via executive order and via Congress the FDA to be an aggressive and robust regulator to combat a public health issue that has been identified by the White House, high cost products, facilitating generic entry, etc. So, well, putatively, FDA would be given additional tools. They'll have additional work. You marry that to the fact that we are experiencing in an ongoing way a reduction in force. Many of the folks, the key intellectual firepower at the agency, the institutional knowledge, the folks that would actually implement these new policies and rules are gone. So it's difficult to predict, given the relatively short timeline, 6 months, whether or not we'll actually see any movement to achieve these policy objectives given the ongoing reduction in force.
Well, thanks to both of you for this fulsome discussion of how the EO relates to FDA type issues and certainly this overlap with the five Grassley bills. So, maybe to close out, let me talk a little bit about the drug pricing perspective here. And I'll just highlight one aspect, which is Section 3, which addresses the Inflation Reduction Act. So, for a while, commentators had wondered how President Trump would deal with the IRA, because obviously it came from the prior administration. Would he abandon it? Would he enhance it? And so Section 3 in the executive order makes clear that Trump certainly intends to use the IRA provisions. So Section 3 has three pieces to it. The first piece talks about asking the Secretary of Health and Human Services to issue guidance within 60 days for initial price applicability year 2028. So there's been final guidance issued for 2026-27. So the next cycle would be to have proposed guidance for 2028. The guidance for the prior ones, 2026, came out in March. I mean, the initial guidance, and for 2027, it was issued in May. So now, 60 days from April 15th, when this executive order was signed, doesn't seem to depart too much from the cycle that we've seen for the prior two rounds here with the proposed guidance. The second subsection here talks about the Part D redesign and essentially premium stabilization. So, as we probably all recall, toward the end of last year, there was an issue with Part D premiums increasing unexpectedly as a result of the changes IRA was making to the Part D benefit. And the Biden administration had to set up this demonstration project to stabilize premiums. So here, within 180 days, there's supposed to be um, a recommendation on how to best stabilize and reduce Medicare Part D premiums. The third piece here is interesting because, again, it touches on congressional prerogatives. So here, the secretary is instructed to work with Congress to modify the IRA's negotiation program by aligning the time periods for eligibility between small molecule drugs and biologics. So, as it currently stands, a NDA approved small molecule drug can first become eligible 7 years after approval, while a biologic first becomes eligible after 11 years. So, this so called pill penalty has been discussed widely, including in the last Congress. And here, the executive order instructs the secretary to, quote, work with Congress to modify the law to align those two time periods. If that were to come to pass, it would be very interesting to see how that would impact the drugs already on the list? Would some that might no longer be eligible if the 7-year period for NDA drugs becomes 11 years, would they fall out? How would that happen? So definitely something to be focused on and to watch. There's always a concern with budget neutrality. Eliminating the so-called pill penalty would exclude more drugs from the negotiation process for longer. So it remains to be seen how that might all be addressed. Let me mention one more time the relaunch of the biweekly drug pricing digest, and we'll put a link for subscribing to that here in the show notes. So with that, we can maybe return to the question we had asked at the very beginning. Which Olympic sport is it like? Maybe we start with you, Ben. What do you think? Which Olympic sport have you picked?
Well, I've thought long and hard about this, Chris. I would say we have an issue or a perceived issue of lack of generic competition, high drug prices, etc. And we have talked about a lot of different tools to address that issue. So I'm going to go with fencing. We're going to throw a bunch of stuff against the wall and see what sticks.
Very good. I really like that analogy. Bill, what have you come up with?
I fear it's going to pale in comparison. My Olympic sport is trampolining, and many of you aren't even aware that it's an Olympic sport. And here's why: it's exciting. It's kind of fun to watch. There are highs and lows. There are judges involved, so there's an element of intrigue, like ice skating, right? What are the rules? Do they really count? Um, but here's the most existential piece. Um, when I watch trampolining, I ask myself, what am I watching? What is this? And I think there's kind of an element of trying to see what comes of all of these initiatives. Are they politically symbolic? Will they translate into actually changes in the law? Will they just translate into kind of enforcing current law more efficiently? Um, and so I'm very interested to see what comes of it. And I don't know if that's an incredible time, but I'm going to double down on trampolining.
Very exciting. I had to really discipline myself here to stay on the list of Olympic sports because there's so many other things that you think of. But I had to pick canoe slalom, and I hadn't really heard of this before. But essentially, here you navigate a whitewater course by passing through 25 upstream and downstream gates in as quickly a time as possible. And it seems to me here that's kind of what we're doing. We're being thrown these gates we have to pass through by the president. We're being thrown more gates to pass through by Congress. And we have to react really quickly while we're on this water course, hurtling downstream to figure out what's the best pathway to make it successfully through all these hurdles, get our therapies to market, and get reimbursement. So I think that wraps up the substance of our podcast. And as always, we now have to figure out where do we go for the after party. Bill, I think you had a good idea. Where are we going?
Well, I live in the burbs and drive a minivan, so I'm not equipped to suggest a place for a cool party. So what I did was I turned to a much cooler colleague. So I'll call out the great Merrill Bartlett, who, for listeners that don't know, is a lawyer in our FDA group who practices with me and Ben. She is a fantastic attorney, an even better person, and she has suggested Happy Gemini, which is a wine bar with great handmade pizza.
Excellent. That sounds great. Can't wait to go. Thanks to Ben Haas and Bill McConagha for joining the podcast today and sharing insights on the FDA-related provisions in Trump's drug pricing executive order. And thank you to our listeners for checking out the Latham & Watkins drug pricing series, which is part of our Connected With Latham podcast. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you have questions or would like additional information, please email us using the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. and you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins, LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.